Princess Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha occupied a unique position within Europe's interconnected royal network, born British, linked to the Romanovs through marriage, and carrying German dynastic blood through her father's line. She bore children across two marriages under radically different political circumstances, creating a family story that spans the collapse of imperial Europe. One child died in childhood, another never lived past birth, while others became central figures in the complex world of post-imperial exile dynasties. This video follows each child in birth order. Each life is completed fully before moving to the next. No digressions, no jumping between timelines. Princess Elizabeth was born on March 11, 1895, at the New Palace in Darmstadt, the first child of Princess Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha and Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse and by Rhine. Her birth represented the continuation of the Hesse dynasty, which had governed the Grand Duchy of Hesse since 1806 and maintained close ties to both the British royal family and the German imperial court. As the firstborn child of this marriage, Elizabeth carried expectations that extended far beyond her immediate family, representing a new generation that would theoretically strengthen the bonds between British, German, and Russian royal houses. The marriage between her parents had been arranged with typical dynastic considerations, uniting Victoria Melita's Coburg heritage with the established Hesse line. Elizabeth's birth occurred during a period when European royalty still functioned within a stable system of interlocking relationships, where marriages sealed political alliances and children represented future diplomatic assets. Her position as the eldest child of a Grand Ducal house automatically placed her within the highest ranks of German nobility, with potential marriage prospects extending across the continent's remaining monarchies. Elizabeth's early years unfolded within the structured environment of the Hesse court at Darmstadt, where protocol and tradition governed daily routines. The household maintained the formal customs expected of a German Grand Ducal family, with Elizabeth receiving early education from governesses while being gradually introduced to court ceremonies and social expectations. Her parents' marriage appeared stable during these initial years, allowing for a conventional upbringing that prepared her for eventual dynastic responsibilities. The young princess developed within a multilingual environment, as was standard for children of her rank, learning German as her primary language while being exposed to English through her mother's heritage and French through court protocol. Her education followed established patterns for royal daughters, emphasizing languages, music, and social graces rather than academic subjects. The household's daily rhythms revolved around court functions, religious observances, and seasonal movements between residences, providing Elizabeth with a structured but privileged childhood typical of her generation. The relationship between her parents during these early years appeared to follow conventional patterns, with public ceremonies and family portraits suggesting domestic harmony. Elizabeth participated in family gatherings and court celebrations, gradually assuming the ceremonial roles expected of a Grand Ducal heir. Her development proceeded according to established royal protocols, with careful attention paid to her health, education, and social preparation for future dynastic obligations. The deterioration of her parents' marriage culminated in divorce proceedings initiated in 1901, fundamentally altering Elizabeth's circumstances and challenging the stability of her upbringing. Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig and Princess Victoria Melita's separation violated conventional expectations for royal marriages, which traditionally endured regardless of personal compatibility. The divorce created unprecedented questions about Elizabeth's custody, her position within the Hesse succession, and her future marriage prospects within a royal system that typically shunned divorced families. Practical arrangements following the divorce required careful negotiation between competing family interests and legal jurisdictions. Elizabeth remained primarily with her father in Darmstadt, maintaining her position as heir to the Grand Duchy of Hesse, while her mother's departure from court created a significant void in her daily life. The absence of maternal guidance during these formative years represented more than personal loss, as royal mothers traditionally managed their daughters' social education and eventual marriage arrangements. The divorce proceedings attracted attention throughout European royal circles, creating whispered speculation about the family's stability and Elizabeth's future prospects. Other royal houses observed the situation carefully, as divorce remained virtually unprecedented among reigning families and raised questions about marriage alliance reliability. The scandal surrounding her parents' separation inevitably affected Elizabeth's social position, though her status as heir to Hesse provided some protection from complete social isolation. Legal documentation from the divorce proceedings addressed Elizabeth's custody arrangements and financial support, establishing precedents that would later influence other royal separations. The settlement ensured her continued recognition within the Hesse succession while acknowledging her mother's ongoing parental rights. However, the practical implementation of these arrangements proved complex, particularly given the social stigma attached to divorce within royal circles. In October 1903, Elizabeth contracted typhoid fever while residing at the new palace in Darmstadt, beginning a rapid illness that would prove fatal within weeks. Typhoid remained a significant threat to European populations during this period, despite medical advances, and frequently proved devastating to children regardless of their social position. The disease's onset appeared sudden, though contemporary medical understanding limited physicians' ability to provide effective treatment beyond supportive care and fever management. The young princess's illness prompted immediate concern throughout the Hesse court and attracted attention from extended family members across Europe. Medical specialists were summoned to provide treatment representing the best available care for a patient of her rank, though therapeutic options remained severely limited by early 20th century medical knowledge. The household mobilized around Elizabeth's care, with court physicians maintaining constant attendance while family members prepared for various outcomes. News of Elizabeth's deteriorating condition spread through royal networks, prompting expressions of concern from related European courts. The potential loss of the Hesse heir carried implications beyond immediate family grief, as her death would extinguish the direct line of succession and require complex arrangements for the Grand Duchy's future governance. Court officials began discreet preparations for multiple scenarios while publicly maintaining optimism about her recovery. The fever's progression followed the typical pattern of typhoid infections, with periods of apparent improvement alternating with dangerous relapses. Contemporary medical records document the various treatments attempted, including cooling measures and dietary modifications, though these interventions proved insufficient against the disease's advance. The palace maintained careful records of her condition, understanding that her illness carried significance beyond the immediate family circle. Princess Elizabeth died on November 16, 1903, at the new palace in Darmstadt, 8 years old and the last direct heir of the immediate Hesse line. Her death prompted immediate dynastic complications for the Grand Duchy, as the succession now required examination of collateral branches and potential heirs from related German noble houses. The funeral arrangements reflected her position as heir apparent, with ceremonies conducted according to full Grand Ducal protocol despite her young age. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death revealed the complex consequences of her parents' divorce for dynastic continuity. With no surviving children from the marriage between Ernst Ludwig and Victoria Melita, the Grand Duchy of Hesse faced succession questions that would ultimately require resolution through alternative arrangements. Court officials began examining genealogical records to identify legitimate heirs from related noble lines, while also considering the possibility of adoption or other legal mechanisms to ensure governmental continuity. Victoria Melita's reaction to her daughter's death occurred against the backdrop of her already strained relationship with the Hesse court. Having remarried into the Russian imperial family, she occupied an ambiguous position regarding her former husband's domain and her deceased daughter's legacy. The funeral arrangements required careful diplomatic management to accommodate her presence while respecting the sensitivities created by the divorce and subsequent remarriage. Elizabeth's burial took place in the Rosenhöhe Cemetery in Darmstadt, where other members of the Hesse family had been interred. The ceremony attracted representatives from various European courts, acknowledging both her dynastic significance and the broader implications of her death for German noble succession. The funeral proceedings followed established protocols while adapting to the unusual circumstances created by her parents' marital history and current separate lives. The death certificates and official announcements carefully documented Elizabeth's position within the Hesse succession, ensuring historical clarity about her status at the time of death. These records became crucial for later genealogical research and succession planning, as the absence of direct heirs required extensive examination of family relationships and legal precedents. In early 1900, Princess Victoria Melita became pregnant with her second child during a period when her marriage to Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig had begun showing signs of strain. The pregnancy occurred 5 years after Elizabeth's birth, a gap that had already prompted speculation about the couple's relationship and the absence of additional heirs for the Grand Duchy. Contemporary royal expectations demanded multiple children to ensure succession security, making each pregnancy a matter of dynastic importance beyond personal significance. The announcement of the pregnancy initially raised hopes within the Hesse court for a male heir who would strengthen succession prospects and provide insurance against the various threats that could affect Elizabeth's future role. Royal families traditionally celebrated the prospect of sons as dynasty insurance, particularly given the political instabilities that were beginning to emerge across Europe in the early 20th century. The timing of this pregnancy suggested a possible reconciliation between the parents, though private correspondence indicates continued marital difficulties. Medical care during the pregnancy followed the protocols established for royal mothers, with court physicians providing regular monitoring and specialized attention. The resources devoted to Victoria Melita's prenatal care reflected both her personal importance and the dynastic significance of potentially producing a male heir. Contemporary obstetric practices, however, remained limited in their ability to predict or prevent the complications that would ultimately affect this pregnancy's outcome. The child was stillborn in December 1900 at the new palace in Darmstadt, representing a devastating loss for both parents and the broader dynastic expectations surrounding this pregnancy. Historical records identify the child as male, which intensified the tragedy given the succession implications of losing a potential heir. The stillbirth occurred during the final weeks of pregnancy, when expectations had been highest for a successful delivery and healthy child. Official documentation of the stillbirth followed the discrete protocols typically applied to such losses within royal families. No name was recorded for the child, reflecting the customs of the period regarding children who died before or during birth. The absence of naming conventions for stillborn royal children meant that this potential heir disappeared almost entirely from historical records, existing primarily in private family correspondence and medical documentation. The burial arrangements for the unnamed son followed simplified protocols appropriate for a child who had not achieved independent life. Interment occurred within the Hesse family burial grounds, though without the ceremonial aspects that would have accompanied the death of a named and recognized family member. The grave markers and cemetery records reflect this distinction, providing minimal identification for future genealogical research. Court officials managed the announcement of the stillbirth with characteristic discretion, acknowledging the loss without drawing unnecessary attention to the failure to produce a living heir. The official statements emphasized the family's grief while avoiding detailed discussion of the medical circumstances or broader dynastic implications. Despite his brief existence, this unnamed child occupies a significant position in understanding the succession pressures that affected the Hesse dynasty during this crucial period. The loss of a potential male heir left Elizabeth as the sole surviving child, intensifying the importance of her eventual marriage prospects and the continuity challenges that would ultimately face the Grand Duchy. The stillbirth also contributed to the growing strain within Victoria Melita's marriage, as the absence of additional children reduced the common bonds that might have sustained the relationship. Genealogical records acknowledge this child's existence as part of the complete accounting of Victoria Melita's offspring, though his unnamed status creates challenges for historical documentation. Later biographical treatments of the family typically mention the stillbirth in passing, focusing instead on the surviving children who achieved independent lives and historical significance. The absence of detailed contemporary records reflects both the period's customs regarding stillborn children and the family's desire to minimize discussion of what represented both personal tragedy and dynastic failure. The timing of this loss, occurring as the marriage between Victoria Melita and Ernst Ludwig approached its final crisis, suggests the emotional and practical impacts that such events could have on royal relationships already under strain. The failure to produce additional heirs undoubtedly influenced the eventual divorce proceedings as dynastic considerations typically supported marriages that might otherwise dissolve under personal pressures. Grand Duchess Maria Kirillovna was born on January 2, 1907, at the Villa Edinburgh in Coburg, the first child of Princess Victoria Melita's controversial second marriage to Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia. Her birth occurred after a period of intense family and political upheaval, as Victoria Melita's remarriage had violated Orthodox Church regulations and created a significant scandal within both Russian imperial circles and broader European royal society. The choice to give birth in Coburg rather than Russia reflected the couple's uncertain status within the Romanov hierarchy and their effective exile from St. Petersburg court life. The circumstances surrounding Maria's birth carried complex implications for her future status and recognition. While her father held the rank of Grand Duke within the Russian imperial family, the irregular nature of her parents' marriage raised questions about her own dynastic position and potential inheritance rights. The Russian Orthodox Church had initially refused to recognize the marriage, creating canonical obstacles to Maria's acceptance within traditional Romanov succession frameworks. These ecclesiastical complications would follow her throughout her life, affecting both her social position and her children's future prospects. Victoria Melita's decision to have the child in German territory rather than attempting to establish residence in Russia demonstrated the practical constraints imposed by imperial disapproval of her marriage. The Coburg location provided safety and family support while maintaining distance from the political turmoil that was beginning to affect the Romanov dynasty. This geographic choice also ensured that Maria's birth would be recorded within German administrative systems, providing documentation that would prove crucial during later years of political instability. The announcement of Maria's birth prompted varied reactions across European courts, where opinion remained divided about the legitimacy of her parents' union. Some royal houses acknowledged the child's birth with traditional congratulations, while others maintained disapproving silence that reflected their positions on the marriage controversy. These early diplomatic responses established patterns of recognition and rejection that would influence Maria's social prospects throughout her childhood and adult life. Maria's early childhood unfolded primarily in Western European locations as her parents maintained residence away from Russia due to continued imperial disapproval of their marriage. The family established households in various cities, including periods in Paris, Coburg, and other locations that provided safety from political persecution while allowing access to appropriate social and educational resources. This itinerant lifestyle became a defining characteristic of Maria's upbringing, preventing the establishment of stable court routines that typically shaped royal children's development. The education provided to Maria followed adapted protocols for a child of her theoretical rank, though practical limitations required modifications to traditional Grand Ducal standards. Private tutors provided instruction in languages, history, and cultural subjects appropriate for her heritage, while her parents attempted to maintain connections to Russian Orthodox traditions despite their geographic separation from traditional religious communities. The challenge of preserving cultural identity while living in exile became a central theme of Maria's formative years. Financial considerations significantly affected the household's operations, as Victoria Melita and Kirill lacked access to the full resources that would typically support a Grand Ducal lifestyle. The family relied on personal savings, family support from Victoria Melita's Coburg relatives, and occasional assistance from sympathetic members of various European royal houses. These economic constraints required careful management and influenced decisions about residence, education, and social participation. Social interactions during Maria's childhood reflected the complex position occupied by her family within European noble society. While some circles welcomed their presence and acknowledged their titles, others maintained distance due to the ongoing controversies surrounding the marriage and its recognition. Maria's development occurred within this atmosphere of conditional acceptance, learning to navigate social situations where her status remained ambiguous and potentially contested. As Maria matured, questions about her identity within the broader Romanov family became increasingly prominent, particularly as political events in Russia began threatening the entire imperial system. The family used the title Grand Duchess for Maria, reflecting her father's position within the Romanov hierarchy, though this usage remained contested by various family branches and Orthodox authorities. The question of legitimate succession rights became more pressing as the Russian Revolution eliminated the practical foundations of imperial governance. The collapse of the Romanov dynasty in 1917 fundamentally altered Maria's theoretical position, transforming her from a potentially disputed member of a reigning family into a participant in exile politics and claimant genealogy. Her father's assumption of various titles and claims to imperial succession directly affected Maria's status, elevating her importance within émigré communities while simultaneously intensifying disputes about legitimacy and recognition. These developments required her to understand complex political and legal arguments about dynastic continuity during adolescence. Maria's education expanded during this period to include detailed instruction in Russian history, Orthodox theology, and the political theories that supported various claimant positions. The family maintained correspondence with other Romanov survivors and émigré leaders, ensuring that Maria understood her potential role within restoration movements and succession debates. This political education occurred alongside traditional aristocratic training, creating a unique preparation for adult responsibilities that might never materialize into actual governance. The social position of the family within émigré communities required careful management of relationships with competing Romanov branches and their supporters. Maria learned to participate in ceremonial events and community gatherings that maintained the appearance of imperial continuity while avoiding commitments that might alienate potential allies or supporters. These skills in diplomatic neutrality became essential as various family members advanced conflicting claims to leadership within the exile community. In 1925, Maria married Prince Karl of Leiningen, a union that represented both personal choice and strategic dynastic planning within the limited options available to Russian émigrés. The Leiningen family possessed legitimate German noble credentials and had maintained their social position despite the broader collapse of Central European monarchies. The marriage provided Maria with an established household and recognized social status, while offering the Leiningen line connections to both Russian imperial heritage and broader European royal networks. The wedding ceremony took place in Coburg, reflecting continued family connections to Victoria Melita's ancestral territories and providing a neutral location that avoided the political complications that might have accompanied celebrations in other venues. The guest list included representatives from various European noble houses, though the absence of certain family members reflected ongoing disputes about Maria's legitimacy and the appropriateness of recognizing her marriage. These diplomatic nuances required careful management to avoid creating new controversies or deepening existing divisions. The establishment of the new household followed conventions appropriate for German nobility while incorporating elements that acknowledged Maria's Russian heritage. The couple maintained residence primarily in Germany, though they traveled regularly to participate in émigré gatherings and maintained connections with other Romanov family members. The marriage represented a practical adaptation to post-imperial realities while preserving theoretical claims to historic significance. Financial arrangements for the marriage required negotiation between families that had lost traditional sources of income due to revolutionary upheavals and territorial changes. The Leiningen properties provided some economic security, though the couple faced the same challenges that affected most émigré nobility during the interwar period. The management of reduced circumstances while maintaining appropriate social appearances became a constant concern throughout their marriage. Maria gave birth to 6 children between 1928 and 1939, establishing a family that would continue both Leiningen and theoretical Romanov lineages into the post-World War II period. The children were raised with awareness of their complex heritage, receiving education that acknowledged both their German noble position and their Russian imperial connections. The family faced the ongoing challenge of preserving cultural identity while adapting to the practical realities of life in an increasingly unstable European political environment. The early years of Maria's motherhood coincided with growing political tensions across Europe, requiring constant attention to safety and stability for the growing family. The household moved several times during this period, responding to changing political conditions and seeking locations that provided both security and appropriate social environments for the children's development. These relocations became routine aspects of family life, though they complicated efforts to establish lasting community connections. Financial pressures intensified with each additional child as the family's resources remained limited despite their noble status. Maria learned to manage household economies that balanced the maintenance of appropriate social standards with the practical constraints imposed by reduced income and uncertain political conditions. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving family dignity became essential skills that she passed on to her children. The children's education reflected the complex cultural inheritance they had received, incorporating elements of German, Russian, and broader European traditions. Maria ensured that they understood their genealogical connections while preparing them for adult lives that might require significant adaptation to post-war realities. This educational approach emphasized cultural preservation alongside practical preparation for uncertain futures. The outbreak of World War II created immediate dangers for Maria's family due to their complex national identities and residence in German territory. Prince Karl's participation in German military activities reflected both patriotic duty and practical necessity, though it also created potential complications given the family's Russian connections and émigré politics. The war years required constant adaptation to changing conditions while maintaining family unity and protecting the children from direct military threats. Prince Karl died in 1946 from illness related to his wartime experiences, leaving Maria widowed with 6 children and limited financial resources. The loss of her husband eliminated the primary source of family stability and income, requiring immediate adaptation to dramatically changed circumstances. The post-war period in Germany offered few opportunities for émigré nobility to rebuild their economic positions, intensifying the challenges faced by the family. Maria's management of widowhood required skills in both practical household administration and the preservation of family morale during a period of widespread European devastation. The children's continued education and development became her primary responsibility, though resource limitations forced difficult decisions about priorities and possibilities. The family's survival during this period demonstrated Maria's resilience and adaptability in the face of accumulated losses and uncertainties. The broader collapse of European noble society during and after the war fundamentally altered the social context within which Maria had been raised to operate. The elimination of traditional support networks and the displacement of entire communities created isolation that previous generations of émigré nobility had not experienced. Maria's response to these challenges established patterns that would influence her children's subsequent approaches to their inherited identities and possibilities. Maria spent her final years managing the complex legacy of her family's imperial connections while adapting to post-war European realities that offered little recognition for historical claims to significance. The establishment of communist governments across Eastern Europe eliminated any practical possibility of restoration, transforming theoretical Romanov claims into purely genealogical curiosities. Maria's approach to these changed circumstances emphasized family preservation over political activism, focusing on her children's welfare rather than dynastic ambitions. The family's reduced circumstances required constant attention to practical matters of survival and education, leaving little energy for the ceremonial activities that had once defined émigré noble life. Maria maintained correspondence with other Romanov family members and participated selectively in community events, though her priorities clearly centered on immediate family welfare rather than broader political or social obligations. This practical focus reflected her understanding of post-war realities and the limited prospects for meaningful restoration of imperial institutions. Maria died in 1951 in Amerbach, Germany, where the family had established their final residence. Her death marked the end of a generation that had experienced both imperial privilege and émigré adaptation, bridging the gap between pre-revolutionary Russian court life and post-war European reconstruction. The funeral arrangements reflected both her noble heritage and the modest circumstances that characterized her final years. Maria's children continued the family's adaptation to modern European life while maintaining awareness of their complex genealogical heritage. Several pursued professional careers that utilized their linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge, while others focused on family life and community participation. The family's integration into German society represented successful adaptation to post-imperial realities while preserving elements of inherited identity. The genealogical significance of Maria's line lies primarily in its continuation of both Romanov and Leiningen bloodlines into the contemporary period. Her descendants maintain awareness of their imperial connections while participating fully in modern European society, representing a successful model of aristocratic adaptation to democratic institutions. The family's history illustrates both the possibilities and limitations faced by émigré nobility during the 20th century's political transformations. Historical assessments of Maria's life typically emphasize her role in preserving family continuity during periods of extreme political instability. Her ability to maintain household stability while adapting to constantly changing circumstances demonstrates the practical skills required for aristocratic survival in post-imperial Europe. The family's continued existence represents one model of successful transition from imperial privilege to middle-class integration. Grand Duchess Kira Kirillovna was born on May 9, 1909, in Paris, the second child of Victoria Melita and Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich of Russia. Her birth occurred during a period when the family had achieved greater stability in their exile, having established routines and social connections that provided a more secure environment than had been available during Maria's early years. The choice of Paris as birthplace reflected the family's integration into Western European émigré society and their acceptance within French social circles that welcomed displaced Russian nobility. Kira's position as the younger daughter created different expectations and opportunities compared to her older sister Maria. While Maria carried the burden of being the eldest and potentially most significant dynastic representative, Kira's development occurred with somewhat less pressure regarding future marriage alliances and political responsibilities. This relative freedom allowed for a childhood that emphasized personal development alongside the preservation of cultural heritage that remained central to family identity. The household's financial situation had stabilized somewhat by the time of Kira's birth, as the family had developed networks of support and established routines that maximized their limited resources. Victoria Melita's experience managing émigré circumstance had created systems that ensured appropriate education and social preparation for both daughters while acknowledging the constraints imposed by their political situation. The family's adaptation to Western European life provided Kira with exposure to multiple cultural traditions while maintaining connection to Russian Orthodox heritage. Early childhood development occurred within the multilingual environment that characterized émigré noble households, with Kira learning French, German, and Russian alongside English inherited through her mother's British connections. The linguistic diversity prepared her for adult social situations that would require communication across multiple European cultural contexts, while preserving access to Russian émigré communities that maintained their homeland's traditions and political discussions. Kira's education followed the pattern established for her sister, emphasizing cultural preservation alongside practical preparation for adult responsibilities within émigré society. Private tutors provided instruction in languages, history, and social graces appropriate for her theoretical rank while acknowledging the practical limitations imposed by the family's political circumstances. The educational program included detailed attention to Russian Orthodox traditions and imperial history, ensuring that both daughters understood their genealogical heritage and its contemporary significance. Social preparation required careful navigation of the complex émigré social structure, where various Russian noble families maintained hierarchies and relationships that reflected pre-revolutionary court protocols while adapting to Western European customs and expectations. Kira learned to participate in émigré gatherings and ceremonies that preserved imperial traditions while developing the adaptability necessary for interaction with non-Russian noble and bourgeois society. The family's residence in Paris provided access to cultural institutions and educational opportunities that might not have been available in other locations, allowing Kira to develop artistic and intellectual interests that complemented her formal instruction. The exposure to French cultural traditions broadened her educational foundation while maintaining the Russian emphasis that remained central to family identity. This cultural fusion became characteristic of her generation of émigré children who inherited imperial traditions while adapting to modern European life. Physical education and social skills received attention appropriate for a young woman expected to marry within European noble circles, though the practical limitations of émigré life required adaptation of traditional protocols. Kira's preparation for adult society emphasized practical skills alongside cultural preservation, acknowledging that her future would likely require greater self-reliance than previous generations of Grand Duchesses had needed to develop. In 1938, Kira married Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, eldest son of Crown Prince Wilhelm and grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II. creating a union that linked émigré Russian nobility with displaced German imperial family members. The marriage represented strategic alliance building between families that had lost political power but maintained social significance within European aristocratic circles. The match provided both families with enhanced prestige and created genealogical connections that acknowledged their shared experiences of political displacement. The wedding ceremony took place in Potsdam, symbolizing the groom's family's continued connection to Prussian territories despite their loss of political authority. The guest list included representatives from various European royal houses, reflecting the broader networks that supported both families despite their changed circumstances. The celebration required careful diplomatic management to acknowledge the family's imperial heritage while avoiding political complications that might have endangered participants or created unwanted attention from Nazi authorities. The establishment of the new household occurred within the complex political environment of pre-war Germany, where the Prussian royal family maintained an ambiguous relationship with National Socialist authorities. Kira's integration into German noble society required adaptation to local customs while preserving elements of her Russian heritage that remained important to family identity. The marriage created a household that bridged German and Russian émigré traditions while navigating the increasing political pressures of the late 1930s. Financial arrangements for the marriage reflected the reduced circumstances faced by both families, though the Prussian connection provided access to remaining family properties and social networks that offered some economic security. The management of household resources required practical skills that neither family's previous generations had needed to develop, creating shared challenges that influenced the marriage's character and the couple's approach to family responsibilities. Kira's role as Princess of Prussia developed within the constrained environment created by World War II and its aftermath, requiring constant adaptation to changing political and social circumstances. The couple established residence in various locations as military events and political developments forced repeated relocations, creating a nomadic lifestyle that characterized much of their married life. The household's stability depended on maintaining neutrality amid competing political pressures while preserving family safety and cultural continuity. The war years brought immediate dangers to the family due to their complex national identities and residence in German territory. Prince Louis Ferdinand's position within the Prussian royal family created both protection and vulnerability, as Nazi authorities maintained ambiguous relationships with displaced German nobility while viewing émigré Russian connections with suspicion. Kira's adaptation to these circumstances required diplomatic skills and cultural flexibility that enabled family survival during extremely dangerous periods. The couple's public role remained carefully limited during the war years, as political activities could have endangered both immediate family and extended networks of noble relatives and supporters. Kira learned to maintain appropriate social appearances while avoiding commitments that might have created political complications or exposed the family to persecution. These survival strategies became essential skills that influenced her approach to post-war social and political situations. Household management during the war required resourcefulness and adaptability that previous generations of Prussian royalty had not needed to develop. Kira's Russian émigré background provided experience with reduced circumstances and uncertain conditions that proved valuable during the widespread disruptions created by military conflict and political upheaval. The family's survival reflected both practical skills and fortunate timing that enabled them to avoid the worst consequences of wartime persecution. Kira gave birth to 7 children between 1940 and 1957, establishing a family that continued both Hohenzollern and theoretical Romanov lineages into the contemporary period. The children's births occurred during various phases of World War II and its aftermath, requiring constant adaptation to changing circumstance while maintaining family unity and cultural continuity. The large family created both blessing and burden, providing dynastic security while intensifying resource management challenges. The children's education reflected the complex heritage they inherited, incorporating elements of German, Russian, and broader European traditions, while preparing them for adult lives in post-war democratic societies. Kira ensured that they understood their genealogical significance while developing practical skills and adaptability necessary for success in changed political environments. This educational approach emphasized cultural preservation alongside realistic preparation for contemporary opportunities and challenges. Financial pressures intensified with each additional child as the family's resources remained limited despite their noble status and theoretical claims to historical significance. The post-war period in Germany offered few advantages for émigré or displaced nobility, requiring creative approaches to household economy and children's preparation for adult independence. Kira's management of these challenges demonstrated the practical skills that enabled aristocratic families to maintain dignity while adapting to democratic societies. The children's development occurred within social environments that acknowledged their heritage while providing integration into contemporary German society. Kira's approach to child rearing emphasized cultural awareness alongside practical preparation, ensuring that the family's genealogical connections remained meaningful while enabling successful adaptation to modern European life. The establishment of democratic governments across Europe fundamentally altered the context within which Kira and her family operated, eliminating traditional sources of authority and recognition for noble claims to significance. The family's adaptation to post-war realities required abandonment of political ambitions while maintaining cultural and genealogical awareness that preserved family identity. Kira's management of this transition demonstrated both acceptance of changed circumstances and determination to preserve meaningful elements of inherited tradition. Geographic stability became possible during the post-war period, allowing the family to establish permanent residence and develop community connections that had been impossible during the war years. The choice of residence location reflected practical considerations regarding economic opportunity and social acceptance while maintaining access to noble networks that preserved cultural continuity. The family's integration into German society represented successful adaptation while preserving distinctive identity elements. Social participation during the later post-war period emphasized community involvement and charitable activities rather than the political or ceremonial roles that had characterized previous generations of noble life. Kira's approach to public engagement reflected understanding that contemporary European society offered different opportunities for meaningful contribution while respecting historical heritage. The family's continued recognition within noble circles provided social satisfaction while acknowledging changed political realities. The management of family finances during the Reconstruction period required continued attention to practical matters while taking advantage of improved economic conditions that benefited broader German society. Kira's experience with reduced circumstances provided valuable background for household management during prosperous periods, ensuring that improved conditions strengthened rather than threatened family stability and cultural preservation. Kira died in 1967 in Saint-Briac-sur-Mer, France, where the family had maintained residence during her final years. Her death marked the end of a generation that had experienced imperial childhood, émigré adaptation, wartime survival, and post-war reconstruction, bridging multiple historical periods while maintaining family continuity. The funeral arrangements reflected both her noble heritage and the family's integration into contemporary European society. The funeral attracted representatives from various European noble houses, acknowledging Kira's significance within networks that preserved aristocratic traditions while adapting to democratic political systems. The ceremony balanced the recognition of her imperial connections with acceptance of contemporary funeral customs, creating commemoration that honored her complex heritage while reflecting modern practices. The attendance patterns illustrated the survival and adaptation of noble social networks despite fundamental political changes. Burial arrangements acknowledged both Kira's Prussian marriage connections and her Russian émigré heritage, creating memorial recognition that preserved awareness of her complex genealogical significance. The gravesite became part of broader noble burial traditions that maintained cultural continuity while adapting to contemporary practices and expectations. The memorial inscriptions reflected both historical awareness and acceptance of changed circumstances. The immediate family's management of funeral arrangements demonstrated their successful integration into contemporary society while maintaining appreciation for inherited traditions and obligations. The balance achieved between historical recognition and contemporary practices illustrated the family's adaptation strategies and their approach to preserving meaningful heritage while embracing modern life. Kira's children achieved successful integration into contemporary European society while maintaining awareness of their complex genealogical heritage and its historical significance. Several pursued professional careers that utilized their linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge, while others focused on family life and community participation within democratic societies. The family's continued existence represents successful aristocratic adaptation to post-imperial political and social conditions. The genealogical significance of Kira's line lies in its continuation of both Hohenzollern and theoretical Romanov bloodlines, while demonstrating successful adaptation to democratic institutions and contemporary European life. Her descendants maintain awareness of their historical connections while participating fully in modern society, representing effective balance between heritage preservation and contemporary integration. The family's history provides examples of successful noble adaptation to fundamental political change. Historical assessments of Kira's life emphasize her role in preserving family continuity during periods of extreme political instability while adapting to democratic societies that offered new opportunities alongside fundamental challenges. Her ability to maintain household stability during wartime disruption and post-war reconstruction demonstrates practical skills and cultural flexibility that enabled aristocratic survival in changed political environments. The family's continued prosperity represents one successful model of noble adaptation to contemporary European democracy. The broader significance of Kira's life lies in its illustration of the possibilities and limitations faced by émigré nobility during the 20th century's political transformations. Her experience demonstrates both the challenges created by political displacement and the opportunities provided by democratic societies for families willing to adapt while preserving meaningful cultural traditions. The family's integration into contemporary German society provides evidence for successful aristocratic adjustment to post-imperial European democracy. Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich was born on August 30, 1917, in Porvoo, Finland, during one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history, as revolutionary events were destroying the imperial system into which he had been born. His birth occurred just months after Tsar Nicholas II's abdication and during the period when various revolutionary factions competed for control of the former Russian Empire. The choice of Finland as birthplace reflected his parents' recognition that Russia itself had become unsafe for members of the imperial family, even those who had been living in exile prior to the revolution. The timing of Vladimir's birth created immediate complications for his future status and recognition within Romanov genealogical frameworks. Born as the last Tsar was approaching his eventual execution, and as Bolshevik forces consolidated power across the former empire, Vladimir entered the world as a member of a dynasty that was simultaneously being destroyed by revolutionary violence. His theoretical position as male heir within the Kirill branch of the family would become significant only years later, as other claimants to imperial succession were eliminated by execution or death in exile. The family's residence in Finland provided temporary safety, but also emphasized their precarious position as political refugees dependent on the hospitality of a newly independent nation that maintained its own complex relationship with both revolutionary Russia and the broader European political situation. Vladimir's earliest years unfolded against the backdrop of continuing violence and political upheaval that made return to Russia impossible, while creating uncertainty about the family's long-term prospects for safety and stability in any particular location. The immediate practical challenges of caring for an infant while managing political exile required adaptations to traditional protocols for raising Grand Ducal children. Victoria Melita and Kirill faced the unprecedented situation of preserving imperial traditions and identity, while acknowledging that the political foundation for those traditions had been completely eliminated. Vladimir's upbringing would necessarily differ from previous generations of Romanov children due to these extraordinary circumstances. Vladimir's childhood occurred entirely within émigré communities, as the consolidation of Bolshevik power in Russia eliminated any possibility of returning to traditional Romanov territories or reclaiming confiscated imperial properties. The family established residence in various Western European locations, creating a nomadic lifestyle that became characteristic of émigré existence during the interwar period. The constant relocations required adaptation to different educational systems, languages, and social environments while maintaining consistency in family values and cultural preservation. Education for Vladimir emphasized both practical skills necessary for survival in exile and theoretical knowledge about Russian history, Orthodox tradition, and imperial governance that preserved his connection to dynastic heritage. Private tutors provided instruction that balanced contemporary subjects with historical education designed to prepare him for potential future responsibilities that might never materialize into actual authority. The educational program reflected the complex challenge of preparing a potential imperial heir for unknown future circumstances. Financial constraints significantly affected the family's ability to provide the lifestyle traditionally associated with Grand Ducal rank, requiring creative approaches to maintaining appropriate social status while managing severely reduced resources. Vladimir's childhood occurred within households that maintained dignity and cultural traditions while adapting to economic limitations that forced constant attention to practical matters of survival and advancement. These circumstances provided education and resourcefulness that previous generations of imperial heirs had not needed to develop. The social environment of Vladimir's childhood included regular contact with other émigré noble families and Russian expatriate communities that preserved cultural traditions while adapting to Western European customs and expectations. The young Grand Duke learned to navigate social situations that required understanding of both preserved imperial protocols and contemporary democratic manners, developing diplomatic skills that would prove essential throughout his adult life. Religious education remained central to Vladimir's upbringing as the family maintained strong connections to Russian Orthodox traditions despite geographic separation from traditional religious centers. The preservation of Orthodox practice provided cultural continuity and community connection while reinforcing family identity during periods of political uncertainty and social displacement. Vladimir's religious formation occurred within émigré communities that adapted traditional practices to available resources and contemporary circumstances. The death of Kirill Vladimirovich in 1938 elevated Vladimir to the position of senior male representative within the branch of the Romanov family that maintained the most credible theoretical claim to imperial succession. This inheritance occurred when Vladimir was 21 years old, requiring immediate assumption of responsibilities and public roles that had been theoretical during his childhood and adolescence. The timing of this succession placed enormous pressure on a young man who had been raised in exile without practical experience in governance or political leadership. The recognition of Vladimir's claim to leadership within émigré Romanov circles remained contested by other family branches and political factions, creating ongoing challenges that required diplomatic management and careful attention to genealogical arguments and canonical regulations. The complexity of succession debates within the scattered émigré community demanded detailed knowledge of imperial law, Orthodox Church positions, and historical precedents that Vladimir needed to master while simultaneously developing practical leadership skills. The assumption of titular imperial authority during the late 1930s occurred as European political conditions were deteriorating toward the World War, creating additional challenges for émigré leadership that needed to maintain neutrality while preserving community cohesion. Vladimir's early years as head of the family coincided with increasingly dangerous conditions that threatened émigré communities across Europe while limiting opportunities for meaningful political activity or restoration planning. The responsibility for representing Romanov interests required development of diplomatic skills and political understanding that enabled navigation of complex relationships with various European governments, émigré political organizations, and competing Russian expatriate groups. Vladimir's leadership occurred within an environment where symbolic authority carried real consequences for community welfare, while lacking any practical power to provide security or resources for his theoretical subjects. Vladimir's formal assumption of the title Emperor of all the Russias in 1938 represented both the culmination of his family's dynastic ambitions and acknowledgement of the purely theoretical nature of imperial claims in the contemporary political environment. The proclamation occurred within émigré ceremonies that preserved traditional protocols while acknowledging the absence of territory, subjects, or governmental apparatus that would transform theoretical authority into practical governance. The title provided symbolic leadership for émigré communities while creating obligations to represent Russian interests without governmental resources or recognition. The development of imperial court protocols within exile conditions required creative adaptation of traditional ceremonies and administrative procedures to available resources and contemporary circumstances. Vladimir's household maintained elements of imperial ceremony that preserved cultural traditions while acknowledging the limitations imposed by reduced finances and political displacement. The balance between symbolic authority and practical constraints became a defining characteristic of his approach to leadership responsibilities. The relationship between Vladimir's imperial claims and various émigré political organizations created complex diplomatic challenges that required careful management to avoid alienating potential supporters while maintaining appropriate distance from controversial political activities. The preservation of theoretical imperial authority demanded neutrality in émigré factional disputes while providing symbolic leadership that could unite competing groups around shared cultural and national identities. International recognition of Vladimir's claims remained limited to émigré communities and sympathetic individuals within various European societies, as contemporary governments maintained diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union that precluded acknowledgement of alternative Russian leadership. The absence of governmental recognition created isolation that forced reliance on private networks and cultural organizations for support and recognition of imperial authority. In 1948, Vladimir married Princess Leonida Bagration-Mukhransky, a Georgian princess whose genealogical credentials provided appropriate dynastic background for imperial marriage while acknowledging the practical limitations of émigré society for potential marriage partners. The marriage created household stability and dynastic continuity while maintaining connection to broader Caucasian noble traditions that complemented Russian imperial heritage. The union represented adaptation of traditional marriage alliance strategies to contemporary émigré circumstances. The wedding ceremony took place in Lausanne, Switzerland, providing neutral territory for celebrations that avoided political complications while acknowledging the couple's imperial claims and noble heritage. The guest list included representatives from various émigré communities and sympathetic European noble houses, creating recognition for the marriage while respecting the political sensitivities that surrounded émigré activities during the early Cold War period. The birth of daughter Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna in 1953 provided dynastic continuity for Vladimir's line while raising questions about female succession within traditional Romanov inheritance frameworks. The daughter's education and preparation for potential future leadership responsibilities became central concerns for household management while acknowledging the ongoing political impossibility of restoration. The family's approach to child rearing balanced preservation of imperial traditions with practical preparation for contemporary European life. Household management during the post-war period required continued attention to financial constraints while maintaining appropriate social status and preparing for potential political opportunities that might emerge from changing international conditions. The family's residence in Western Europe provided security and educational opportunities while maintaining distance from Soviet territory that remained dangerous for Romanov claimants. Vladimir's public activities as imperial claimant included ceremonial appearances, political statements, and cultural preservation efforts that maintained émigré community cohesion while representing Russian interests to international audiences. The development of public positions required careful balance between political engagement and symbolic leadership, acknowledging contemporary realities while preserving theoretical claims to legitimate authority. These activities provided meaning and purpose for imperial claims while avoiding direct confrontation with Soviet authorities. The maintenance of correspondence with other Romanov family members and émigré political leaders created networks of support and recognition that sustained Vladimir's leadership role within scattered expatriate communities. These relationships required diplomatic management of competing claims and political disagreements while preserving family unity and shared commitment to cultural preservation and national identity. Vladimir's statements regarding Soviet policies and international developments reflected his position as representative of alternative Russian leadership while acknowledging the practical limitations of émigré political influence. The balance between principled opposition to communist governance and realistic assessment of restoration possibilities required careful attention to international political developments and émigré community morale. Cultural activities, including support for Orthodox churches, historical preservation projects, and educational institutions, provided practical outlets for imperial leadership while serving émigré community needs. Vladimir's involvement in these activities demonstrated alternative approaches to national leadership that emphasized cultural continuity over political confrontation while maintaining connection to Russian heritage and identity. Vladimir's later years occurred during the period of Soviet reform and eventual collapse, creating possibilities for Russian political change that had seemed impossible during earlier decades of his leadership. The emergence of glasnost and perestroika policies created new opportunities for émigré participation in Russian cultural and political discussions, while raising questions about restoration possibilities and the role of imperial claimants in post-Soviet governance. The gradual opening of Soviet society to international contact allowed for renewed communication between émigré communities and Russian populations, creating opportunities for Vladimir to articulate imperial positions to audiences within Russia itself. These developments required careful navigation of changing political conditions while maintaining consistency with decades of émigré political positions and cultural preservation efforts. The practical management of imperial claims during the late Soviet period required adjustment to rapidly changing political conditions while preparing for potential participation in Russian political reconstruction. Vladimir's approach to these opportunities emphasized cultural contribution over political competition, acknowledging the complexity of post-Soviet transition while maintaining commitment to imperial values and national service. Vladimir died in 1992 in Miami, Florida, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union and during the early period of Russian Federation formation. His death occurred as possibilities for émigré participation in Russian reconstruction were emerging, creating both culmination of his lifelong hopes and recognition that restoration of traditional imperial authority remained impossible even under changed political conditions. The succession of Vladimir's daughter, Maria Vladimirovna, to leadership within the imperial claimant community created precedents for female inheritance within Romanov tradition while maintaining continuity of dynastic claims into the contemporary period. Her assumption of leadership occurred during the post-Soviet period when émigré participation in Russian cultural and political life became possible, creating opportunities for imperial claimant activities that had not existed during Vladimir's lifetime. Vladimir's approach to imperial leadership established patterns for émigré political activity that emphasized cultural preservation over direct political confrontation while maintaining theoretical claims to legitimate authority. His model of leadership provided frameworks for meaningful émigré contribution to national identity and cultural continuity without requiring restoration of traditional political institutions. The genealogical significance of Vladimir's line lies in its preservation of Romanov bloodlines into the contemporary period while demonstrating adaptation of imperial traditions to democratic political environments. His family's continued existence provides connection to Russian imperial heritage while acknowledging the fundamental political changes that have transformed European monarchy and noble authority. Historical assessment of Vladimir's life emphasizes his role in preserving Romanov cultural traditions and political claims during the long period of Soviet governance while preparing for potential participation in Russian reconstruction following political change. His leadership provided continuity for émigré communities while adapting imperial authority to exile conditions and contemporary political realities. The family's continued activities represent ongoing connections between Russian imperial heritage and contemporary Russian Federation development.